Hi, and welcome to the Cornelius Seed Podcast. Thank you for checking out our podcast. Established in 1935, we're an American-owned and family-owned independent seed company. And we're excited to partner with you by bringing you 5 generations of agricultural experience and decades of industry expertise. In our podcasts, you can expect to gain valuable and timely information to aid you in making decisions for your operation. We'll keep things simple and informative, and much like our motto, Planet Profit.
In today's episode, we listen in on one of the sessions from our Partner to Profit post-harvest grower meeting that was hosted across 4 locations in Cornelius Country. In this session, Cornelius Seed lead agronomist Craig Allaman shares what we learned from the 2023 growing season and how we can use that to prepare for 2024. Craig covers a variety of topics ranging from early summer drought. He analyzes the corn planting date strategies, the effects that wildfire smoke may have had on our crop, corn diseases, rootworm management, and really how those traits hold up. He also discusses nitrogen replacement using Proven 40 and so much more. So let's jump in and take a listen.
Okay, I'm going to start here with my kind of year in review. So we'll talk about a lot of things that I saw go on during the growing season, and always we're trying to get to what can we learn for next year. Okay, that's our goal, not just to review the year, but if there's anything we can pull out of it and that we need to work on. So we started in two days ago. On Monday, we were in Council Bluffs with mainly the 4-star people. So I wanted to give them a little bit of background of where I was from. So I've just kind of been repeating this. We always have some new people in the room. So just a little information. So this is where I live. And the earliest part of our family that homesteaded in the area, homesteaded right there about 1.5 miles away from where I live now. And that was in 1835 by the town of Little York. Town probably wasn't even there at the time, but does anybody know where Little York is? No. Well, you guys, yeah, you have to know. So now, John Wayne, you guys know John Wayne's from Iowa, right? Originally, Winterset, Iowa. But before his parents moved to Winterset, his grandparents lived right over here. That's where they homesteaded. So that's the claim to fame for Little York, Illinois. Okay, so as we back out a little bit to show you where Little York is, there it is down there, Quad Cities. So I'm so far west in Illinois, I have to go east to come to the Cornelius headquarters. Now, in 1993, this was the first house that my wife and I rented after we got married. Okay, and it was on this farmstead, and we rented it from this guy right here. That's George Hoffman. He and his wife Fidelis were like another set of grandparents for us. And if you look, I forgot the last couple days, but that is one of those brick phones. Does anybody remember those things? Okay, it was the size literally of a brick, and I mean a paving brick, not a regular brick. And man, did I think I had the technology back then. One, you probably weren't even born back then, but that was good technology back then. And we had better reception. James was talking about the reception. I had better reception with that phone than I ever do with my phone today. But anyway, so this, where we lived there when we were first married, it was on the corner of K22 and C38, which was 13 miles straight north of Sioux City, Iowa. That was my first job after college. I was part of the Council Bluffs district for American Cyanamid. And we loved it out there. A lot of times we say we wish we would never move back. But when you get ready to start having kids, you need those built-in babysitters, right? So we moved home, transferred back there with AMSI. After that, I spent 4 years with a very large retailer down there, and then I've been in the seed business ever since. So just a little background to where I'm from. Now we're going to dig into some of these. You guys should have seen, a lot of you have seen this already. It's been in other presentations that I've given this year already, but we met in June. And at that point in time, we were at the very end. We didn't know it at the time, but we were in the very end of that early summer drought that we went through. Does everybody remember that? Because that caused a lot of things to go on through the growing season. And as you can see, we really shared in that through the Corn Belt. Everybody took part in that early summer drought. That's not real normal. Usually it's a lot spottier than that, right? But we all shared in that. Now at the kickoff meeting, we showed this slide in comparison with it. We talked at the summer meeting that we probably had taken the top end of the yield off already, but we were looking pretty good considering going through 6 weeks of drought. You know, it was surprising how decent the crop was looking. But by the time we got to August, we had alleviated a lot of that, and I'll blow that up a little bit, but certainly not everywhere, right? And there's going to be people in this room that were in some of these red areas, and they know what we're talking about, okay? So we alleviated it pretty good, and you look at this band here. When that drought finally broke, that band across Illinois and a lot of Missouri down here, they got rain for a week, about every other day, soaked in, actually got a little bit of subsoil buildup. In Missouri, of course, has a drought and a flood every year, right? That's Missouri for you. They always have a drought and a flood. This year was no different. So I guess my point is here, so with this drought, and as we back up here, we look how bad it was there. So let's go back to the 80s. You know, we had a pretty bad drought in the 80s. Would hybrids in the 80s have done as well as our hybrids did this year? Okay, because the rule of thumb was everybody at harvest is like, it's way better than I thought. Whether you're in the red area or in the good areas, it's still better than we thought it would be, right? So we have come a long ways with hybrids, all right? And that's breeding. I mean, I think the technology improvements in just the breeding process are better than the traits even, and have added more value and more yield to us. You know, having the marker assisted breeding where they know certain markers on that DNA that give us drought tolerance. Okay, being able to identify that and having it in these corn plants that we're looking at to grow every year new. Okay, so we've come a long ways, but are we bulletproof yet? Are we bulletproof with our hybrids and varieties? Do we can withstand anything or not? And we saw that this year, and here's just a quick example. I mean, these are just a couple of profit plots, okay? These two plots are not really that far apart. And I really just wanted to show what a plot average is under those conditions of really, really severe drought. We still have to have water to yield, all right? The hybrids are not resistant to that. 114 bushel in a profit plot that's tough. And then 310 not very far away. You know, it's just a matter of getting enough water. Soybeans are no different. Here's an example here, 36.4 bushel average, and there's a 90 bushel average. Okay, we have to have the water. This is what that's the past, that's what happened this year, but this is what is kind of concerning now, and that we have to look, as we look forward, this is what we're looking at. And that's our subsoil moisture. We could not have raised as good a crops as we did this year without some subsoil moisture, okay? That carried us through during those 6 weeks of really dry weather. And right now, and as we drill down a little bit closer, our subsoil moisture is not in a good situation. Now, it really wasn't last year at this time either, and we charged up those soils in that February, March timeframe, you know, and that put us in pretty good shape. But my dad was always, every year we had this discussion in the spring, oh, it's going to be a drought. It's going to be a drought. Of course, he went through the 88, 89 drought. So every year was going to be a drought. And I said, Dad, we live in Illinois. It rains in the spring, you know. Now, there will be a drought sometime, but most times we get rain. We're going to need to do that. And these rains we've had over the last couple of weeks are good. We need to continue to get them before the ground freezes up. And then we're going to have to get some in the spring as well. I think the interesting part here is, as you look here on these maps where we got some rain and we alleviated that early drought and we had really, really, really good yields, we don't have much subsoil moisture, okay? We got fed in those areas. We fed that yield along the way during the summer, but it's not like there's subsoil moisture there yet. So the whole area, we're going to need to get some of that moisture. Northwest Iowa, you know, they've had pretty bad drought last couple of years. They're starting to get that alleviated a little bit. Moved to the east, unfortunately. Okay, so early planted soybeans. I'm going to touch base on how this went this summer. And I've talked about this 2 or 3 years now. It's a program that I am 100% behind, have fully adopted it on our farm. This is the 3rd year in a row that we have planted our soybeans earlier. And this is one of our fields here, and just kind of following it as a case study. But remember, what we're trying to do with early planted soybeans is we're trying to hit the early flowering date. Okay, soybeans flower based on the length of the nighttime. And the summer solstice being June 21st, in the past with our normal planting dates, we would usually flower after the summer solstice. So once we got seed treatments, we could protect against sudden death and things like that. And they started doing these studies and planting these beans earlier. What they were finding is if they hit the V3 growth stage before that summer solstice, because you're going to have the same night length, a week before summer solstice as you do the week after. So if you get to that V3 growth stage, these beans will start flowering, okay? And what that gives us is on average, an additional 10 days in the R2 stage. So this is R1 when we see the first flower. R2 is when we're flowering all up and down the plant, okay? So an additional 10 days in the R2 stage, and on average, that is giving us an additional 2 nodes per plant. And that's where the yield's coming from. We have 2 more nodes with pod cluster on each node, and that's the increased yield. I have 2 things that are my favorite thing about it. The first thing is it's free. Doesn't cost you a thing, okay? Nobody's sending you a bill for $7 an acre to plant your beans early. The second thing I like about it is, personally, it's just on a personal note, it keeps me out of the corn planter, when I shouldn't be in the corn planter. Okay? We don't have that penalty on the front side by planting beans too early like we do with corn. And I have some really good examples of that here in just a minute. So to finish off the early planted soybeans, these first year I ever got to what I thought was a truly early planting date. The earliest I've been able to get in because of soil conditions in the past was the 21st of April. So this year we had a really nice week after Easter, particularly in the southern regions. We had good soil conditions. We had good temps, okay? Soil temps were even good. So we started planting the day after Easter. That is the insurance date, by the way, in Illinois that they changed to. We were emerged by the 19th. So on the 19th here, when we emerged, we had 2 nights in a row where it got down to 31 degrees. Didn't hurt a thing, okay? Soybeans will produce an antifreeze-like substance, and it has to get pretty darn cold to hurt these beans. Probably 28 degrees is what it needs to get down to, okay? So the risk is not what we thought it used to be with soybeans planting early. Now, I mentioned we needed to hit the V3 growth stage. So when I saw the first flower on June the 12th, we were at V8 because we got them planted that ultra early. Okay, so that factory was already really big and robust and going when we started hitting that flowering window. The yield on this field, I do a lot of work through field view, just on whole field type yields, but 75 bushel is what this field ended up being. It was 2136Es, as you can see. So you're probably saying, oh, well, that's good. It's a good yield, but there were a lot of 75 bushel an acre fields, right? So as we compare into this area here, all these fields in blue were planted that 10th or the 11th, okay? These fields that are in red were planted on the 15th of May, all right? The only difference, they all had fungicides, okay? I'm thinking, well, maybe fungicide was the difference. They all got a fungicide application at the R3 stage. So the only significant difference here is just that early planting date and hitting that early flowering window. And so those are pretty, and these are scale tickets to the elevator type yields, okay? So that's pretty significant. That takes the concept of that system and it takes it out to a whole field comparison, and I think it's pretty impressive. By the way, you guys ask questions as we go along. We'll have time at the end, but if you got a question, just yell it out. Something I thought we should go back and review a little bit So we got recharged February, March kind of time frame. Soil moistures were pretty good. And then we got really windy. You guys remember that? We had low humidity and a lot of winds, Western Iowa type winds we were getting. We're sitting here on the front porch and watching this dust storm move in. They had one south of Springfield earlier where they had cars piled up, fatalities. I mean, it was unusual type of spring that way. We had corn stalks drifted where we usually have snow drifts. My mom had her cars in her garage, everything shut up. It looks like they've been sitting in a barn for 20 years. It was really weird. But what that gave us is, even though we had good soil moisture, the surface was pretty darn dry, okay? So we had to really watch when we started planting. And that week, that 10th of April when we started, we had to make sure we were getting out and digging in every field we went into, and one of our phrases is stop, dig, and measure. Get out of that planter tractor, dig, and measure what your depth is. But what you're looking at when you're measuring is, am I in good soil moisture? And not just in the edge of it, far enough there that you're going to imbibe that seed. It takes 30% of the weight of corn kernel to germinate, and soybean takes 50% of its weight to germinate. So we got to get that in moisture. That's really, really important. And every field can be different. And if you have a field that the soil types change pretty drastically, the zones in the field can be different. It's worth the time to get out and make sure that you're getting into moisture. We were closer to 3 inches than we were to 2 with both corn and soybeans that week. Now later on, when we got back in the field after our initial planting in the first week in April, and we were more normal, we'd gotten rains, but we didn't have that real dried out upper surface, then we could do pretty much our normal planting depth. But we had to chase that moisture early on. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about early planting on corn. So this is a state of Iowa here, just a typical planting curve with corn. Now on soybeans, the front end of this curve here, that'll be pretty flat because we don't have that penalty on early planted soybeans. Why would that be? Why did we not get in as much trouble on the early planting on soybeans? What's more important in corn than it is in soybeans? Temperature, even emergence. You're getting to it. Uniformity. Somebody say population. Population. But does anybody want to have the argument on what's the best soybean population? It's going to be 100 to 160, right? And that's pretty much true. I mean, you can go a huge population range in soybeans. They have the ability to compensate, to fill in the rows, to branch out more when you plant them thinner. They have a million different ways they can compensate for population. But corn, I mean, you're only going to have so many ears out there. It's a mathematics game with corn, right? So many ears, so many kernels per ear, and so much weight in the kernels. So we can really get hurt on the front end here on corn. Now, we're going to have to play. We're never going to hit the top of that curve with everything, right? I mean, that might be a 24-hour period. We're going to have to play on both sides of ultimate here. We probably need to be starting a little early because we don't want to get into this portion of the curve here. The slippery slope on late planted corn is a severe penalty, okay? But this here we might be able to predict. And I'm going to show you again my own personal example, mistake, whatever you want to call it. I would like to think that we just have really bad weather forecasters is the reason I make some of these mistakes. But nonetheless, we looked at this slide early on too, middle of the summer. These two are from the field that I'm going to show you in a minute, okay? So we saw the cold weather coming on the weekend after Easter. We had a lot of people in the field. We made the call. We communicated to you guys that we think Friday at dark, shut the corn planters down, okay? We're going to get really cold Saturday night. We want to have that 24 hours of having a warm drink of water instead of a cold drink of water. and not hurt that corn seedling, not have an imbibitional chilling issue. And I think we did a pretty good job with that. Okay. We had planted for a couple of days. So this was, this is the 19th, but we planted corn. We started on the 13th and planted on the 14th, which was Friday. Okay. We did get by the imbibitional chilling. I didn't see any issues there, but the weather forecast at the time was dipping down and then back up. Okay. So we went and planted, we probably planted maybe a third of our acres during that early window. And then it started to get cold and we started to get rain, and we didn't get back in the field until the first week in May, which the first week in May in my area is still ultimate planting. You know, that last week in April, first week in May, that's 100% yield potential. Okay. So, but what we did see here after it got cold, we just saw regular old cold injury on the corn. Okay. That plant starts to get confused. It's really cold. It's circling around in there, not able to push out of the ground. And then eventually the coleoptile here, which is protecting those leaves, ruptures, and those leaves are not going to push out. So I ended up losing, I dropped 34.5 and I ended up with 31,000 on all that early planted corn. Now, that's better than having those plants come out of the ground, having 3,500 plants that don't produce an ear. They're just robbing sunlight, moisture, and things like that. So I thought I'd probably still okay. I probably have enough yield there to potentially reach 100%. And when we looked at this at the summer meeting, at the end of that 6 weeks of drought, this corn looked really good. It looked way, way better than that first week in April corn. It got out of the ground. It was rooted down. It was into more water, and it looked fantastic. So I'm thinking, I did the right thing there. This is the yields, okay? And I'm showing two completely different fields here, but I'm after the same hybrid. And there's your planting dates. So there's the early planted corn. Here's the later planted corn, okay? And now I'm drawing down to really get apples to apples. I know from decades of yield history that these two fields are always within a couple bushel, okay? They're really, really close. But then I really want to draw down the exact same soil type within the fields. I got a 21 bushel yield penalty for that early planted corn, okay? Looked great. It's just a population thing. It's just get out the calculator. It's just ears times kernels times weight per kernel, okay? I did that with a second hybrid. Again, very comparable fields with the yield history. There's your planting dates, early one on the left. Later one on the right, and that was a 17 bushel yield penalty with that particular hybrid. So maybe it had a little more flex in that ear, you know, maybe it closed that gap a little bit, but still a pretty good penalty. Now again, I wouldn't have planted if I knew it was going to get that cold. So if you have a decent forecast that you trust, you know, I should have just stayed out of the field at that point in time. But I think it is a real good real world comparison there. So where did the yields come from? And I have to put if it did, because I know we're going to be in a room and there's going to be people that were in that tough area, okay? But they were still better, way better than we thought. So where did that come from? Well, we talked a little bit already, subsoil moisture, okay? Mainly from that recharge in February and March. You don't go 6 weeks without rain and not have subsoil moisture with the kind of yields that we have. And that's also a really, really good time of the year to be rooting down, all right? End of May, first half of June, we want to be rooting down. When we have saturated soils at that time of the year, that always makes us a little nervous. Because on a normal year, we don't worry about the early summer drought, we worry about the late summer drought, right? The grain field drought's what we always worry about with drought. Month of August, late July, month of August. So we want to be really rooted down so later in the year, when we know we're going to get dry, we can grab that subsoil moisture. The Canada forest fires were interesting, mainly in the month of June. You guys remember that, right? It was really weird. The entire country of Canada was burning. So what did that do to our yield? We know we're reducing sunlight, so it's kind of alarming. We have to have sunlight for photosynthesis to keep that plant alive, to fill that grain out. We would really be worried about it if it was later in the summer. But earlier in the summer, we weren't worried about filling the grain out. And there is a school of thought out there that says light diffusion through smoke is not a bad thing. Normally that light's coming in on the canopy. It can get so deep, on a corn plant because you've got shading out. But with smoke, there's a diffusion of that light, like through a prism, okay? So there is a school of thought that more light was penetrating deeper into the canopy. And did it keep the temps cooler when we were under that drought stress? Okay, just by keeping the sunlight not quite as intense. So I think if anything else, if nothing else, it was a wash. I don't think it hurt us. And there's potential that maybe it did help us. Mentioned corn rooting during that early part. That helps during the later summer. Timely but variable rains after we got done with that drought. Okay, and again, depending on where you're at. But once we broke the drought, we did get some very timely rains scattered across the corn belt. Early planted soybeans, again, gave us, I think, that free yield bump. Definitely proved out itself again 3-4 years in a row now. Lack of foliar disease was a good thing this year, right? We were under enough stress. We did not have a lot of foliar disease. Any tar that we saw moved in really, really late, and there wasn't a secondary disease in there with it. I think Chuck mentioned that earlier. Tar spot does not concern me by itself, but tar spot plus anything else is a really, really bad day, okay? It seems to need that secondary disease to be a real yield robbing problem, and it normally moves in pretty late, okay? And then decent August rains, again, that's variable depending on where you're at, but we had some pretty decent August rains when we needed to finish filling that grain out. Okay, somebody asked me to talk about potash deficiency. Did you guys see any potash deficiency this year? Early, yeah. Happened during that early summer drought, right? And we always see some potash deficiency. I'm going to say, Grandpa, really, we've all done this. But when you fertilize the outside of that field, and you got a fence row there, you see that grass ticking on the fence row, what do? You don't want to fertilize the fence row, right? So you move in a couple rows. So Grandpa did that, Dad did that, we've done that, all right? So fence rows, when we end up taking them out, we usually have potash deficiency there. So you're driving along the road every year where that fence used to be, and you see 1-2 rows, corn or soybeans, that are showing that potash deficiency. Really easy to see because it's the leaf margins that turn yellow and then brown. This year I was seeing 4-6 rows in. It was really pronounced. And then we were seeing patches, kind of all across Iowa. Looked like they had IDC everywhere. But it was a potash deficiency, okay? Now, and the question was, I've tested after harvest and my levels are fine. Well, you didn't really have a deficiency, but potash being kind of the canary in the coal mine because of those visual symptoms we see, it was temporarily not able to get into the plant because it has to be in the soil solution. In other words, water, we didn't have any water, okay? So we just simply weren't getting that into the plant. That was during the early summer drought. Later on, once we got rain, got into the soil solution and those things alleviated, some areas they came back later in the summer. It's likely that there were other nutrients that were not available at the time too, but potash is the one that we usually visually see. So just the basics on why is that happen? Well, soil has a negative charge, right? And a lot of the cations, a lot of the nutrients that we're using have a positive charge, or all the cations are positively charged. So they bind to the soil. Anions are negatively charged nutrients, okay? They don't bind to the soil. They leach down through, right? So if we think about that, this would be representing the organic matter. Here's your clay. Clay is really tough. Clay is really thin layers of soil. It attaches a lot of nutrients to it, but sometimes really hard to get, okay, because it's in between those layers. And of course, it's usually pretty wet. But your cation exchange capacity is just the measurement of how many nutrients can be held in your soil. So it's just organic matter and clay. You have heavy organic matter, heavy clay soils, you're going to have high CEC. And then we think about these negatively charged ions here, okay? Nitrate is the one we don't like. That's the big one, right? When our nitrogen finally breaks down in the final form, which is nitrate, it can leach right down through the soil. It's not being bound to it because it has that negative charge. So it goes down through the soil, gets out of the root zone, doesn't do us any good. Or if our soil is really saturated, nitrogen being NO3, microbes need oxygen to survive. They rob oxygen off the nitrogen, the NO3, and then it goes up in the air as a gas. So we like to keep our nitrogen in the ammonium form as long as we can. Sulfur, we used to get a ton of sulfur from our good old coal-fired power plants, right? And then they decided that acid rain was evil and we needed to scrub them and clean that up. And now we don't get that sulfur coming down through the quote acid rain anymore. So we have to add it back into our fertility program. And this is why, because it's negatively charged. It's not going to stay in that soil profile. The interesting one, though, is phosphorus. So the phosphate negatively charged ion. Do we worry about phosphorus leaching in the soil? If we did, we'd hear about it all the time like we do nitrate, because it'd be getting in our tile lines, going down the river and killing everything in the Caribbean Ocean, right? But we don't. We do worry about it running off if we apply it on the surface. But you look here, these are the good ones, the ones with a positive charge. You see we've got aluminum, copper, we've got iron. Phosphate will attach itself to the metals in the soil, okay? So it will attach to the aluminums, the coppers, and the irons. And that keeps it from leaching down. Problem with that is it doesn't get back in the soil solution. The roots really need to grow to the phosphate. So in the spring, when it's really cool and our roots aren't growing very well, corn turns purple, right? Okay, potash deficiency, leaf margins. Phosphorus deficiency, the plant turns purple. Okay, as soon as it warms up, the roots start growing again, it comes out of that because it's getting back and pulling that off of the metals there. So ammonium, I just kind of circled that here because that's the one we like. Ammonium has that positive charge, attaches to the soil. That's why we put N-Serve on if we use anhydrous or Super U or things like that to keep it from breaking down into that nitrate form as long as we can. Talking about nutrients, we always have to talk about keeping your pH balanced, okay? If your pH gets out of whack, all of a sudden we have nutrients that aren't available. The plant is not able to take them up, okay? So if we get on the low side here, get there below a 6 on the pH, start to get things like magnesium, calcium, but probably more important, phosphorus starts to become unavailable. And if we get on the high end, we got phosphorus again unavailable, but that's where we get our iron deficiency chlorosis. So we get out into north central Iowa in particular. Okay, iron is not available. I like to keep mine between a 6.5 and a 7. That's personal preference on that. But realistically, between a 6 and a 7.5 is a good zone to be in. Okay, and remember the pH tests are very accurate. Okay, and we can do variable rate. When we spread our lime, we can do it variable rate now. So that's really a key when you get your test back, get that lime variable rated, bring that soil up to be very even. Okay, seedling disease. So this is kind of a review again. I've had this slide up. Seedling disease, not so bad over here. Central Iowa in particular, after that May planting date, most of the crop was in, we got heavy, heavy rains out there in central Iowa on up into Minnesota. This is Nevada, Minnesota field that I looked at early on. And we had a lot of soil-borne fungal diseases in here, okay, because of those heavy rains. We had a lot of replant out in those areas. But I'm going to say this is fusarium. I sent this into a lab and they weren't able to confirm what it was, which was quite disappointing. But I believe it was fusarium just based on experience and then what it looked like later on. But you'll see here the mesocotyl there. That's what attaches the seed to the crown up here. Okay, and it's just pretty much toast. And every plant, whether it was a decent looking plant or not so much, the mesocotyl was affected in this field. Okay, so we had a lot of that. The pythiums, the Rhizoctonias and the fusariums, those are water spores, okay? That fungus can swim in water and get to the roots, and those are the ones that we really worry about early on at the seedling stage. And the thing that I'm gonna point out here that we'll look at in a minute is you start to see that disease is getting up into that crown a little bit, right? So it's infected the roots, came up the mesocotyl. Now, the seed initially is the only thing feeding the plant, okay, as that seedling is emerging. And then the primary root system takes over and adds to that. And the nodal roots, which are the main roots that we think of, they don't really take over probably B3-ish before they take over feeding this plant. So this is the lifeline there. I mean, that's the pipeline for all these nutrients and water. If this is killed, you know, some of these plants were completely dead and others various stages of injury. Whether this one produces an ear or not is a huge question at this point in time. In most cases, probably not. This plant is so far injured, even if it lives, it's not going to have the ability to put an ear on. And this is what resulted from that early infestation of what I believe was fusarium. We had a ton of crown rot this year. Did anybody see crown rot over here in their fields? Okay, the whole field will be green, and then every now and again, just sporadically, you'll have these plants that are just totally dead. They call those ghosted plants, okay? And that's just simply happening because here at the seedling stage, that disease is starting to set into the crown, and then by the end of the year, eventually that crown is going to be completely inundated with that disease, and then the plumbing is just shut off. No more water, nutrients are going to get up in that plant, and it's just a rapid death, okay? So we saw a ton of that this year. Good seed treatments. We've got probably a superior fusarium seed treatment, maybe a couple years away on the horizon. We went to Viantis a couple of years ago because it is a superior seed treatment for Pythium. So as soon as we get the new one for fusarium, we'll be bringing that on. But that's the risk, again, in planting into cool, wet soils. We get some of that. We like to get out of the ground and blow by that stage before it infects. Also was asked to kind of mention this. Another thing that we saw that was really enhanced was compaction this year, right? We had that early summer drought. If we had compacted soils, a lot of years, if we didn't have that dry soil, maybe the roots would have grown through and we either wouldn't have seen it or we knew it was there, but we got by. But this year, when those soils dried out so rapidly, see, this is really shallow compaction. This is caused by secondary tillage in the spring. Okay, and the bad part of when we get delayed in planting and it gets towards the end of our nice planting curve, what do we tend to do? Get out there a little too quick, probably, right? I mean, I do that. We all do that. So we probably were a day or two ahead with the field cultivator than what we should have here. We only have one root that's made it through that. Here it is, and there it is there. Probably not enough roots to be getting down to subsoil moisture in the kind of drought we had this year, okay? So we need to be aware of that. It's just a thing we always want to pay attention. And we need to alleviate this compaction if we had it this year. Okay, talk a little bit about rootworm management, okay, especially in the face of having our Smart Sack Pro now, all right? And you guys in this room, or if you guys particularly are over west of Dubuque, you're in some of the heaviest rootworm pressure that we run into, that there is in the Midwest. Extended diapause in the state of Iowa was the worst that I've ever seen this year. Okay, so extended diapause is just the northern corn rootworm. It's the way they have adapted to defeat the corn-soybean rotation, right? So what they're doing is they're laying their eggs in corn, but a certain percentage of those eggs are not going to hatch the following year when you plant soybeans into them. And then the next year, when you're back to corn, in that corn bean rotation, those eggs are going to hatch, and you don't have any protection out there. If you haven't addressed it, you don't expect that to happen. And then you're going to have rootworm damage in that first year corn. In Illinois and on up here into southern Wisconsin, we had the same thing happen with the western corn rootworm variant. where it would lay the eggs in soybeans. And those eggs were there the next year in first year corn. I think that was a lot, those were much more prolific egg layers, the Westerns. And that first year corn, after when we had the Western corn rootworm variant, we had a lot more pressure. We'll have heavy pressures with this northern variant, but they're not as heavy as what the Western was. So a smart stack corn to address this issue should be plenty good. We just shouldn't need the Pro. If you want to use the Pro for this issue, it's no problem. But a smart stack, in our experience this year, held up very well under that pressure from the variant. Other things you can do, you can use a conventional, you can use a double Pro if you're putting a soil applied insecticide on there. You know, one of the good ones like Aztec, Counter, Force, you know, one of the good old insecticides. So we don't have to have the trait. Other thing that I'm going to be playing with this a little bit down there, University of Illinois Research Farm, 2 years in a row now. We've always known with a couple of years anyway of corn, when we rotate back to soybeans, we'll get a yield bump, right? We'll get a nice yield bump. We're breaking up some kind of a cycle that we get in that corn bean rotation. Maybe it's a disease, maybe it's just soybean cyst nematode, but whatever it is, we're breaking that cycle up and getting a yield bump. So I don't even know where this started. Somebody got bored or they had extra space or whatever, but they started doing a soybean, and then corn rotation in this testing down there. And they're getting the same thing in that first year of corn after 2 years of soybeans. They're getting a yield bump. So we're breaking up a cycle there. Is it a disease? Is it corn nematodes? I mean, something that we're breaking up there. So I'm going to do some whole field studies so I can show you some field view stuff on this starting next year. But that also would defeat that northern corn rootworm extended diapause. So heavy multi-year corn. So 10 years of corn. The populations of the rootworm beetles are crazy. Mark's starting to sweat over there because he's looked at enough of those fields through his career. This is where I believe your value is with a Smart Stack Pro, okay? Now, the first thing that I would caution you on is if you have heavy rootworm pressure, you know it's there. Putting a Smart Stack Pro on that acre is still going to result in a failure. It's going to result in an unacceptable level of root protection. Because remember, the Pro portion, that RNAi technology, if anything, it kills those larvae slower than the traits that we already have, right? So if you have crazy heavy pressure, they're going to eat a ton of roots before they end up dying, all right? So if you have heavy pressure, the recommendation in multi-year corn would be to plant a Smart Stack Pro product, but still use a soil insecticide or beetle balm the year before, trying to kill those adults before they lay the eggs, or a combination of both, okay? Where it has the value is all of the other existing traits previous to this. If a larva got big enough in its growth cycle, it's able to survive those traded products after that. So maybe it's feeding on, maybe you got intertwined roots with the refuge and the traded product, it's feeding on the refuge, it gets over to the traded, it's big enough, it's going to survive. Problem there is it's going to hatch out as an adult and it's going to lay eggs. And our population never decreases, okay? The RNAi technology does not have that issue. It will kill those larvae, no matter what size they are. So that is why over time in a multi-year, really heavy infestation, we will reduce that population. And eventually we shouldn't need the other control methods if we're able to do that. Smart Stack fit, we still have a fit with Smart Stacks, extended diapause, maybe the first year of a multi-year corn program, or if you want to go ahead and use a Smart Stack and a soil fungicide, 6936, we put it up against any Smart Stack Pro product. Got a massive root and it regenerates those roots just crazy good, okay? So there's still a fit for Smart Stack. We will still bring new ones into the lineup if they're really high yielding. Or until the day when Bayer makes the the trait fee almost the same, which they have a history of doing that. But it still does have a place here for a while anyway. So just wanted to put this up here because you think about the refuge, and I know James mentioned this earlier too, you got a 5% refuge out here, okay? And this is managing your expectations. When you walk out in the field and see beetles, and then call Mark, and Mark calls me, and we go out there and have a lot of fun there in a really nasty time of the year to be in a cornfield. So 5% refuge, if we're planting 35,000 plants, that's going to give us 1,750 refuge plants per acre. Okay, so if you have a heavy infestation, I'm just going to conservatively say that's at least 6 larvae per plant out there. 10,500 beetles per acre that are going to come out of the ground as an adult and lay eggs. Okay, they're going to be flying out there during pollination time frame. So you're still going to have some beetles out there, even with the best control that we can have. So beetle bombing, even in that situation, may help. Okay, silage. We always, when we get a new crop of hybrids, we do have one supplier that does their own silage data. So they've already tested. We get, quality, milk per ton, milk per acre, things like that, ratings. And a lot of them we get from suppliers that haven't done that work, but they'll give us the nod that we think this is going to be a good silage hybrid. Based on the kernel texture, the tonnage thing or the size of the plant, things like that. So we always stick our new hybrids in the Wisconsin silage trial first year out, just so we can have data on everything. And we're in the southern region, and they'll have an early silage trial and a late silage trial in the southern region. So this is this year's crop. And we would like to be, to have a good silage hybrid, you would like to be in that upper right quadrant, because here's yield. So we want to be up high for yield, but we want to be on the right side for quality. So and they're rating the quality here as a milk per ton. Okay. So all of these hybrids really are in pretty good shape. They're all at the midpoint for yield, and they're all on the good side on the quality. With 6824 right there that's kind of the standout on some of these earlier ones. And remember, we have that as a PCE and as a conventional. A lot of the dairy guys in Wisconsin for years have liked to plant a conventional because they think their cows like it better. Okay, they eat it better, and they've proven over time that in a lot of cases they produce more milk from it. So we've got that as PCE and a conventional. There's the 7048 that Chuck had mentioned, 6645 and 6578. On the fuller season, we kind of did the same thing here. They're all in a pretty good range there. There is 7202 that Chuck talked about. 7448 was the last hybrid he mentioned. But a hybrid that's in bold, which 6824 is in bold, that means that it's statistically equivalent to the highest yielding product in the trial. And you see 7235 right there is bold. And in this case, it is the highest yielding silage hybrid in this trial. Okay. It's furthest up and the furthest to the right. So that's going to be a tremendous silage product for us. Last segment that I have left here. So we went to putting Proven 40 on the seed this year as an offer. Proven 40 is basically a biological. It's going to colonize the roots. It's going to pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere, like a soybean plant does through its own natural nodulization, right? So what I'm going to show you again are whole field type studies. There's a lot of replicated studies. You get a ton of things that you can look at from field view, but I just want to pull it down to what I did, my own work this year with our own farms and more of a whole field situation. So this year, I've got 2 different trials, 2 different fields, and I showed this again earlier in December too. This is what Pivot Bio does when they come out. They take several plants, they measure the biomass, they run a chlorophyll meter on it, and they want to be within 3% up here. If they're within 3%, the check versus the Pivot Bio product, then they consider that to be a wash, okay? They're not claiming a yield advantage, they're just claiming to replace nitrogen. So I wanted to kind of follow that up a little bit on my own. So I just did the old-fashioned way, which is taking ear leaves at pollination time frame, send them in the Midwest lab, and they give you, of course, analysis on all the nutrients, but I'm interested here, of course, in the nitrogen, okay? The first study, it was 4.4% more with the pivot, and the other was 3% less. So it's within that 3% range that they're trying to hit. I just wanted to confirm that I'm seeing the same things in the old-fashioned way versus what they're seeing with their, their new study methods there. So we look at the yields here. This is study number 1. So we got 150 pounds of fall applied anhydrous. That is my standard rate that I use for corn following soybeans in my area. This field here, the Pivot Bio field, is 2 fields away from it. And again, these fields have a history of being right on top of each other on yield. That's why I chose them. So if I look here, when I'm comparing them together, 1 bushel yield advantage to the pivot. So it's a wash statistically, okay? So that's proven that the concept is there. Second study. This one, as I looked at field view, and I was basically just going to pull kind of the same information out, and I'm thinking, and I'll show you here, the way I did with this field, the way this became a study is I started around the outside of the field planting. I planted over to here, and I ran out of my Pivot Bio seed, okay? So I had 110 units of 32% on the field, the whole thing. And so then I switched to a split planter when I switched out of the Pivot Bio seed. But of course, the orange hybrid here is the same hybrid that I had the Pivot Bio. So all of a sudden I got myself a nice study here. I just simply went back in and field dressed that additional 40 pounds with UAN at B6, okay? But when I started looking here, I'm like, well, I got 3 soil types running across here. So I wonder what the difference is by soil type. So the first comparison here, here's your soil type. And the proven 40 here was 24 bushel higher yielding than the non-proven 40. And then I switched down to the next soil type, the one right below that. You remember from the map, proven 40 is 6 bushel less than the check there, okay? And I don't know why that is, and I'm not really saying anything about it. I'm just saying it's interesting. We got a different soil type, we got different organic matter levels, whatever's going on there, there is a little difference there. And then when I pull the test across all 3 soil types, it's a 4 bushel yield advantage. So if I would have just looked at that way, that's what I would have seen without pulling apart the different soil types. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Okay, this one, purely accidental study that happened. This farm right here sold last year. The farmer had Nutrien come in and put anhydrous on for him this spring, 200 pounds of anhydrous. He had no idea that there was a field split there. There were flags everywhere, but he put this on my field. He put that 200 pounds, which at the time turned into be, was at the time free nitrogen, right? They screwed up. It's only 17 acres, so they didn't charge me for it. But later on, it looks like it may have cost me money. So, I know this field here is better than this field. This field here has got a old railroad that ran through there. It's got a lot of issues. But I'm harvesting this field, and then I jump over in this, and I'm like, you guys have all been in the combine run, the yield monitor. I get over there, and I'm like, wow, this is noticeably better. It's the same hybrid. I'm like, what is going on here? So I'm just pulling again, making sure I pull out the same soil type here in 2 areas of the field where it's the highest yielding in each field. And I got quite a yield advantage to that proven 40. Again, I'm not really saying anything about it other than just showing it to you. Okay, it was interesting. Makes me wonder if there was 200 pounds of anhydrous in that spring application. But it was pretty late spring. We had that drought, early summer drought, so something was going on there. Okay, are there any questions? I'm going to add one more thing I was just thinking about this morning. I don't know what got me off on that tangent. Have I had any cards go up yet on my overtime? I'm good? Okay. So James and Will and I were out at the ICM conference, Iowa State's a winter conference where they talk about all kinds of agronomic issues. And we were in the one that really stood out for me was the cover crop session, okay? And they were talking about cereal rye in particular and talking about carbon nitrogen ratio, okay? So if you guys think about continuous corn, you all use more nitrogen for your continuous corn than you do your corn on soybeans, right? And why do you do that? Do you offset the carbon, right? Okay, corn has a very high carbon to nitrogen ratio versus soybeans. The microbes that are breaking down that corn residue will use that nitrogen as a food source while they're breaking down that residue, okay? That's all there is to it. They're going to tie up a bunch of that nitrogen to break down the residue, and that's why we need more nitrogen, okay? If you use a cereal rye crop ahead of a corn situation, and I know most of it goes ahead of soybeans anymore, or most of it that I deal with usually, but the carbon nitrogen ratio of that root system of that cereal rye is even a higher carbon nitrogen ratio than the stuff on top, okay? It's pretty high. So even if you're killing that cereal rye off, you still have that root system under there that those microbes again are going to need to break down, and they're going to be robbing nitrogen to do that. So my take home from that study there was that if you're going to do corn following cereal rye, you better start treating it like a continuous corn crop. You're going to need some more nitrogen in there, okay? Or don't do it ahead of the corn, do it ahead of your soybeans, and then you won't have to worry about it. But I thought that was a pretty interesting study. I have not seen that before. Other questions? Yes.
Drought resistance, drought resistance.
Into soybean drought resistance. So the question is there any research or work being done with drought resistance on soybeans like there is with corn? Because we have come a long ways. I don't know of any unless Will knows any or anybody else. A lot of the, we think about, soybeans being a taproot, but soybeans are a shallow taproot. They're not getting down nearly as deep as what the corn is, So that's going to be part of it. There's going to be a limitation there for sure. But that's right. Yep, absolutely. That's a really good question. It could just be the whole redheaded stepchild thing too. No offense to any redheaded stepchildren in the room, by the way. But corn gets a lot more research than what soybeans do.
Now covered some scheme that by SCM resistance.
I believe that it is BASF that I think they're really, Will, have you heard a time frame on that? They're really, really, really far along on that. I don't think that's more than maybe a couple of years away, possibly, that they are going to have a trait for soybean cyst nematode. I'm sure that's why all of a sudden you have seen BASF come up with their own soybean brand, so they can get their trait out there. That's not by accident, and they've started to do that the last couple of years. So, and hopefully, I would assume, but hopefully we'll be able to access that when it comes out for sure.
Well, folks, you just heard one of the sessions from our post-harvest grower meeting. If you like what you heard and are interested in attending one of the meetings that we host, head on over to corneliusseed.com, and on the middle of the homepage, tap on Sign Up Profit. Signing up will get you a notification to the next time that we host one of these. Thanks for listening, and have a great rest of your day.